Okay, so we've got our character set up, got our prerequisites set up, and now it's time to put in an actual button that we can press. We'll start off by making a folder to hold the button, and let's just call it button. Then we'll create a subfolder for the model. Let's call it M model. You can call these anything you want, but I just like to dress these up a bit so they're easy to see when you've got a whole bunch of them. At this stage, if you've got your own button models that you've downloaded from the store or created yourself, you probably want to use them here, or you can just use the ones I've made out of the Unity primitive 3D models that come with Unity. I made prefabs of those. I'll just use the one called button box and drop it into here. Now let's move this somewhere where it makes a bit more sense. Just reset all the positions, and then after we reset the positions, let's move it somewhere roughly roughly chest height, something like that. I'll just hit play to see how that looks. Maybe that's a little low. So we'll move that up a little bit more, a little bit forward, and I'll put it slightly to the left so we make it easier for our character's left hand to grab onto that. And I'll copy the component again, hit stop, paste that back in so it'll be in the right spot next time. So when you move this around, make sure you move it from the parent. Don't just move the button model or something like that. Otherwise your triggers and colliders might not be in the right spot later on. So we can actually take a closer look at the button model. I'll explain it a little bit. It's essentially, we've got the outer box. That's just a typical Unity box. Then we've got the actual button itself, so this will be the part when we click it, it'll move back and forth. And if it actually moves back far enough, I've put in another cylinder and coloured it red. So it's just to mimic a light, so it looks like we're pressing it and the light's coming on. And if you're using your own button model, this will obviously vary, so you'll have to figure out which part is which. But essentially you're always going to have like a case for the button and then the actual button itself usually. To make this button actually interactive, we're going to create another folder, and we're going to call this input handler. And we're also going to put in the input handler component onto this game object. And we're also going to need a collider. Just use a box collider, and you can make it a trigger if you want to, it doesn't really matter. And I'll just shrink the size down a little bit so it matches our box. So the way KINERACTIVE works is when the KINERACTIVE manager is here, it's going to shoot out one of these raycasts that we set up earlier. And when it detects this collider here on our button, it's going to ask if this input handler exists on the same game object. If it does, it's going to say, great, this is an interactive object, let me interact with it. So let's fill out some of the input handler options here. We'll start with the usage instructions. Let's say left click to press. Now the next option is the controls icon texture, which is going to replace our temporary D-pad, and it'll display an appropriate texture for these controls. So we've said left click, so let's select a mouse with the left click highlighted. We have an option to choose our crosshair texture so that our crosshair changes when we highlight an interactive object. Just makes it easier for the user to tell if they're allowed to interact with something or not. And we'll just use a dot. And we can also adjust whether the crosshair gets bigger or smaller as the player interacts. For example, if they click the mouse button, the crosshair scale will increase. So it just gives them a bit more feedback. But we'll just leave it at the default for now. And down the bottom here we enter our inputs, which we'll add in the next section. But so here we can make this 2, for example, and then we would drag our inputs into this section, but we'll just leave it as 0 for now so we don't get any errors. Okay, so this is the fun part of the tutorial. We'll finally see the hand move on its own. So what we're going to do is add a new game object, and we'll call this self-activated input, and we'll go into the inputs on our project, and we will put in self-activated input. So normally we've got like a button input which checks for mouse clicks or anything on the keyboard, anything on a control pad. We've also got an axis input which checks for joystick inputs or A and D or W and S, your up and down arrows, that kind of thing by default. And we've got analog input, and that actually returns an analog value for your joysticks or your triggers on your control pad. And the self-activated input, it doesn't actually return any, it just automatically assumes that there's an input as soon as the interactive object starts. So we'll use this to make our hand move towards the button as soon as we look at it. So that way it'll look like our character's getting ready to press the button. So we'll need to populate some of these fields in order for things to work correctly. Hand side, obviously we want our left hand, so that's, we can choose left or right. We'll start with left. The move speed and the rotate speed, the default's perfectly fine. Now here we get to choose where our hand is actually going to move to. So let's just make a transform, basically make it anywhere for now because we'll move it later on. So we'll call this pause, ready position, and we'll just adjust it. We'll give it a little diamond so we can see it a bit better. Okay, that's way too big. Let's shrink that down. There we go. And that way we've got a pretty good idea of where the hand will end up, and I think that's probably a bit close. Move that back a bit, because this is not so much where the hand ends up, but where the wrist joint ends up. That's just the way the inverse kinematics work in Unity. And we'll go back to our self-activated input, and we'll put this transform into the move rotate to transform field, so that way as soon as self-activated input is activated by the input handler, the hand will move to this point. And we can actually choose an animation if we want to, but we'll just leave the default hand animation for that one. So the next step is to actually put this self-activated input into the input handler so the input handler knows what to do. Grab the self-activated input and drop it onto the inputs field here, and it will automatically change the size and add it in, and it looks for that input component. So let's see how this looks. If we look at it, our hand moves towards it and our UI also changes, and the UI disappears when we look away, which is what we want to. We don't want any instructions on there. So the hand looks a little bit strange. So now that we're in play mode, we can adjust this to ready position, because it does look a bit strange. So let's move it back a bit, and let's rotate it a bit, just so it doesn't look so weird. And we can move it down even. Yeah, that looks pretty good. Okay, we'll copy that, hit stop, paste that in. Let's try that again. There we go. So as soon as we look at it, our hand comes up, Then as soon as we look away, the hand goes away, and notice we got the instructions and we got the crosshair changing as well. Perfect. Now we've also got our instructions still visible when we're not looking at anything. So let's go into the UI area, and we'll just turn all this off. We'll turn off the text field, we'll turn off the raw image, and we'll turn off the background image as well. So that way we're not seeing any of the instructions unless we're looking at something interactive. So just to recap, we created a button folder to hold all our button related scripts and components and models. Then we added in our button model. We placed in an input handler and a box collider, placed in the self-activated input, and we placed in the ready position of where we want our hand to go. And then it was just a matter of putting the ready position into the input, and then putting the input into the input handler so the input handler knows what to do. So now what happens, we look at the button, the KINERACTIVE Manager component says, hey, is there an input handler on this button? And if there is, it uses the input handler's settings here. And in the next tutorial, we get to press the button.